It is, as usual, a great pleasure to be back in Rome. As a Roman, it's always very nice to be invited back. I would like to thank the organizers and the host, of course, for this privilege, but in particular, Ludovica Glorioso, Lieutenant Glorioso, who is here, and Dr. Taddeo for taking care of us in such a wonderful way. I thought about some possible metal-related complement that I could use, gold or silver, but I thought it was inappropriate in a digital age, so I shall not do that. My talk will be philosophical, so I will be tempted to apologize for that. I shall not, since the title of this conference has ethics in the keywords. Philosophy is at home in the context. What I will be more tempted to do is to apologize for a couple of points that might actually be slightly abrasive when here and there some of you will potentially recognize implicit targets. Those of you who don't see the targets, I'm delighted. Those of you who see and have the impression of having been targeted, yes, you are. Target number one. Someone somewhere thought that was not a new weapon, that the elephant in the room could be dealt with in two ways. You could deny its existence or affirm its irrelevance. You have met both. You have met people denying the existence of cyber threats of any kinds. Of course, it's more of the same. Please don't even talk about it. We have the ways and the whereabouts to deal with this. We've been here before. Or, and you have met that kind of strategy as well, well, the elephant in the room is in the room, but it's irrelevant. It's more of the same Cold War and everything else. We've been there before, don't worry. Now, I'm afraid that the Romans paid a high price when they denied the existence of the elephant or underestimate their relevance. It was a long time ago, 280 BC, and I am in the right place where I do not need to explain what happened. What I do need to explain is that it took a long while before the Romans realized how to deal with the problem. 200 years and a bit later, it was, of course, the genius of Julius Caesar who realized that something had to be done about that elephant in the room. Do not listen to those who deny its existence. Do not listen to those who affirm its irrelevance. They are there, they are important. So you better start equipping your legions with axes and make sure that those people, I cannot even start imagining what it means to go running towards an elephant that is attacking you full speed, armed with an axe. There was a time when courage had a different sense from being behind a computer. Well, you run against that sort of elephant armed with an axe, I remind you, and you chop their legs. Well, we also had a different conception in terms of animal ethics at that time, but it did succeed. Caesar did won the battle at Thapsus, and the 5th Legion did get the elephant as its symbol. What I'm going to invite you to do is to get the cyber war symbol and own it. Because let us not wait for 200 years before we realize how to deal with the elephant in the room. It's there, it's relevant, and for goodness sake, we have just realized this in these years. So listen to some of us who are screaming at the top of their voices, please make sure the future generations don't look backwards and say, for goodness sake, another Heraclea battle? Haven't you learned anything from the past? So that was the longish incipit. The talk is divided into 6 points, and I shall try to use my 27 or so minutes left, a bit less probably, wisely, but I'm sure that wisdom will be imposed on me if not exercised. So I shall remind you very quickly and briefly, because I know you know, and it's just a matter of being on the same page, what are the 3 ethical questions that we normally deal with when we do some ethical thinking. And then an episode in the history of humanity, something that has changed our way of behaving with the world, how we've been enveloping or structuring the world around ICTs rather than vice versa. This is important to realize. And why within that particular environment, we've been erasing boundaries, significant boundaries for conflicts. The second half will be the question, so what happens to conflicts in a world that has been structured around technologies and within which some fundamental boundaries we used to have when Napoleon was around, or even maybe during the Cold War, do not apply anymore? What happens to the new elephant? And I shall explore quickly what it means to have conflicts in cyberspace and try to convince you that there's one right way of looking at this and, of course, therefore, a wrong way. I will not anticipate, hoping that this will keep you awake, but the keyword will be infosphere. What happens to conflicts within the infosphere and why we need a kind of information ethics that is the sort of strategy behind the problem. Why the information ethics can actually be the axe you need to deal with the elephant. So, 3 questions first. This, I hope you will forgive me. I know you know, so do not allow me to patronize you. But just in case we were confused, what are the real fundamental questions that we ask when we're doing ethics? Who should I be? The sort of self-constructive, poiesis, construction, the self-poietic question that anyone has asked since we were doing philosophy in Athens, 5th century before Christ. That's the virtue ethics. And in our context, for example, should the military personnel be courageous? I know it's an old value. I'm using it on purpose. And I remind you about being behind a computer versus having an axe. So who should I be? The other question is, what is the right thing to do? That's the substantive thing. Now, there are options there, and if I could do the right thing, I would. It's just that I don't know, and you could tell me. And your next friend who is actually asking you, should I or should I not join the army, is asking that particular question. And then next, why should I do it in the first place? The motivational, which Selma has already raised, I believe rather unsuccessfully, I'm afraid, during the first half of the morning. But the attempt was valiant. We do need to address that too. So the motivational will be distinguished from the substantive and will be distinguished from the self-poietic, not because they are separate, but because first you keep your ingredients separate and then you mix them. You never cook by mixing everything together, whatever you have in the fridge. Let's be careful. So a bit of minimalism, not because things are that simple, but because making them more complex is easy afterwards. You get that? Keep them simple first, make them complex later. Do not start with the complex, because the simple disappears. So let's keep them simple and concentrate only on one question: what is the right thing to do in the context of cyber conflicts? Point number 2. What is the context of cyber conflicts? Where all this is happening? Is there any change? Remember the elephant? Well, the envelope in the world, which will engage us for the next 5 minutes or so, is something that I would like to sketch with a very long perspective. The further the jump, the longer the run up. If you have to jump very far, you take several steps back. So if the problem is big, you better step back and back and back. So we step back all the way to prehistory, the distinction between prehistory and history, and that is when you have ICTs appearing. That's the difference between no way of recording the present and communicating to the future, versus a time when finally you have ways of recording and sort of communicating to the future, so that individual and social well-being start being related to ICTs. There's no Roman Empire without writing. There's no British Empire without way of communicating. I won't speak about other empires. At that point, you start thinking that anything else is going to be more of the same. Recording, communicating, communicating, recording. Until, and I'm so glad to come after Giovanni and his very enlightening talk, until you realize that there's a third element in the ICT business, and that is processing. Books do not process their words. Computers do. And anyone who's comparing the internet, the computer revolution, to the Gutenberg revolution, the book revolution, is stuck in the Middle Age, hasn't seen anything, hasn't understood anything. Because, of course, it's recording, transmitting, communicating, and processing that makes a difference. Processing becomes the essential part of a new society. a new society where individual and social well-being start being dependent entirely on ICTs. You are sitting on top of it. So with a quick, I hope memorable phrase, those who live by the digit die by the digit. And the replacement of a sword with a digit is crucial. Let's not mix the metaphor, let's not talk about the axe, but basically is from a material, energy-based, kinetic, to a immaterial, information-based way of having to do with the world. Any added value, anything else that you want to do is going to be information-related. In fact, it actually depends on information, a lot of information. We were all born out of that picture. Since we were born as humanity, until 2009, we produced 0.8 zettabyte. Do not allow me to tell you what zettabyte is. It's huge. It's a lot of stuff. It's anything we have ever written, produced, spoken about, blah, blah, from year zero in the cave to 2008. And between 2008 and 2020, we will have produced another 35 zettabytes. Take one, add another, more or less. That's 35 times more than we have ever done in the whole history of humanity. Staggering, yes. Does it make a difference? You bet. It's a huge elephant. So that obviously is an important threshold. Thresholds can be overcome. Someone can always tell you the territory on this side is the same thing as the territory on the other side, more of the same. Yes, but it is a threshold. You better have a passport because this is France and that is Italy. So do not be confused by the fact that there is continuity when continuity comes with a barrier. Now, what kind of continuity are we talking about? Well, there's more of the same, well, not quite, but above all, there's going to be more of all this. There are only three limits to what we can predict about the future, and I'm talking to the military in particular. Thermodynamics, basically your physics, your intelligence, what you're going to do with the computers and your inventions, your algorithms and everything else, and memory, the platform on which all this is residing. Of course, all this comes with huge problems: acquisition and storage, usability, security and safety, accessibility, analytics, law and ethics. And for each entry, you could have a special division dealing just with that, because for every entry, you have a particular problem on the cyber conflict level. So complicated, easy to make, because we could spend the rest of the 20 minutes or so, probably less, discussing every point. I won't do that, but I would like to call your attention to the fact that anyone who's going to tell you, oh, surely we have the right ways of doing this, surely, let's say, good old Greek ways of dealing with conflicts have been with us for a long while, we can just reapply that, is missing the boat. All that, and that's the bad news, comes with a price tag every time. So if there's one more message to take from what I'm saying is cyber war is expensive, really expensive. And if we want to think about the future, we need to buy the axes now, because the elephants are coming. So what happens in all this? What happens within this world that is being soaked with information? I speak information and data as if there were no difference. There's a difference you want to know, I'll tell you later, but it's deadly boring. But with all this data floating around, well, we've been thinking about ways of handling all this data autonomously. There are two things we do dislike in life: working and thinking. We have done pretty well with working, that's the engine, and thinking, we're doing our very best with the computer. One day we might actually stop thinking completely if the computer does its job as well as the engine. Until that time, we need something that looks like an intelligence. Trust me, I hope Giovanni will agree with me, we have at the moment, in terms of intelligence, artificial intelligence, what my grandmother had in her fridge. 0. But we have a lot of smart technology. They do what they're supposed to do, and they do it increasingly well for a larger and larger number of tasks. So what has been happening in the meanwhile with all this data and the world? Well, we thought that the real task was to make sure that we had some artificial intelligence that could deal with the world as we deal with the world, as successfully, as intelligently. Start slow, start small, but sooner or later. Meanwhile, instead of saying, well, what kind of intelligence do we want to develop for the world, we were adapting the world to the smart technologies. And that's where a concept from industrial robotics is going to help. It's called envelope, and in robotics, it's actually the 3D space within which the arm is successful. It's a very simple idea. I mean, you do not unleash a robot in a room and ask the robot, build me a car. You build a whole building around the very simple abilities of that robot, and that's called an envelope. So, to come back home, and since I'm not quite sure whether we are recording this or not, I better be careful with reference to my wife. To get what the envelope is and is not, compare the old dishwasher. The dishwasher is a classic context in which we have enveloped a whole world around a very simple robot. Choo, 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 choo. Bit of soap. Choo, 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 choo. Well, clearly, you would not do the dishes that way. I would not recommend it. When I was in the army, we did something similar, but I won't brag about that. That's another story. So we built, as the philosopher would say, a whole ontology around the abilities of the agent in question. I'm talking about a dishwasher. This is a stupid idea. It's something that we don't have, and we don't even know how to build. Not the particular thinking in question, but something like that that then also walks out of the room and drives your car, and I don't know, picks up the post and actually types for you the last essay. That is something that we don't even know how to start building. But there is something very smart, because that is doing what I'm doing, is replacing me as an interface between the dishes in the sink and the enveloped world. That is the world as we know it. That's what's happening now. We're building more and more enveloped environments, and we're building interfaces that can start talking between environments. So that is the sort of smart universe with which we have to cope, and do not listen to anyone who's actually trying to sell you just the dishwasher or the robot. Target anyone? Yeah, I hope so. And if, again, anyone has any impression that we're shifting towards pure philosophy, past the enveloping was a standalone phenomenon, a factory, or you actually bought the whole envelope with the gadget. Today is a whole construction of the environment around AI-friendly features, what I would like to call, just for lack of a better terminology, an infosphere. If you don't like it, think of something else. And then again, since we are in Europe, we better consider what's happening in Europe. This is how Europe is enveloping Europe. This comes from the Digital Agenda and refers to about 20% of the EU population using a laptop to access the internet via wireless while away from home or work. Pause. They're not home. They're not at work. Where the heck are they? Everywhere. They're in the street, in the car, at the shop, Starbucks, because they never leave the computer. They are always within this enveloping environment. It's going to be a robust, cumulative, progressively refining trend. The envelope with which we are dealing is growing quickly. Those are the last figures that I could find, Reuters. If you see the red tag, for those of you too far away, I can read it aloud. That was between 2003, 2010, when we finally had more connected devices than people. Moving forward, you can see that in 2020, there's, that doesn't really fit, the number of people and the number of devices will be 7.6 people versus 50 billion devices connected. You have a way of dealing with those 50 billion devices that is not particularly nice. That is, you get it, a big elephant in the room. So let's think about 2020. Let's not think about Napoleon, because trust me, that Napoleon had different strategies for a different world. The new world in which we live is something that maybe grandma had an experience of. When she worked, she used to walk inside the computer. The computer was the room, and she had a screwdriver. Her daughter came out of the computer became something that she had in front. Her granddaughter is back inside. And is that environment that we need to protect. Is not something else that is different from the world. So hacking is not like hacking your, say, mobile. That would be so wrong. If you hack the information society, If you are intruding the infosphere, it's like saying that you are actually hacking the heart of their society. You are hacking the peacemaker of their society. And anyone who says, nothing has happened so far, so surely we can get along with that. Well, I don't want to live in a society where the peacemaker is unprotected and anyone can actually hack it one way or another. Again, you don't have to believe me. Maybe one of our representatives, Neil Kroes, Vice President of the European Commission, she, commenting on Cyber Europe 2010, the first pan-European cyber attack simulation, said, aloud for those of you too far away, "This exercise to test Europe's preparedness against cyber threats is an important first step towards working together to combat potential online threats to essential infrastructure and ensuring citizens and businesses feel safe and secure online." It doesn't get any more hyper-historical than that, quite naturally. So, because I know that we're running out of time, but trust me, the next slides get lighter and shorter, let me go through that slightly more quickly, because now the framework is in place. So within this infosphere, these hyper-historical societies, the boundaries are being erased. There's a constant blurring between reality and virtuality. When you had a sword or a gun, that wasn't the case. This is happening under our eyes. And of course, there's also a blurring of the distinction between human, machine, and nature. That is just an experiment whereby you can actually use your brain scanner to control a drone. Lots of issues here. So in this case, once again, novelties, remarkable differences that we need to take into account if we want to have a clear understanding of the ethics behind. So shouldn't we just speaking about cyberspace altogether? Well, here's the picture that I want to summarize quickly. We have technology on one hand, growing and growing, and time passing by. We used to kill each other on land, and this is a very well-known story to most of us. We discovered that we could actually kill each other at sea, so we expanded. There's no Roman Empire without control of the Mediterranean. And of course, air at a certain point became essential, so there's no Second World War domination without having the right airplanes. And at some point, space became essential. I mean, Cold War and all the satellites and everything else, we thought we had seen everything. Meanwhile, we were building 3 weapons. We have cybernetics to build robots. We decided that the Second World War could be won also by building a gadget called computer, Alan Turing. And the Cold War required something called the internet. These are 3 major technologies that make the difference in cyber war. They were built for war-related, conflict-related reasons. Just by thinking about why we had built those things, we could have predicted that they were going to fire back. They were weapons in the first place. How can we be surprised that they are being used as weapons now? That's their nature. But thinking is a commodity that we don't often interact with. So we decided, okay, there's a 5th space, cyberspace. Here is the temptation that we might be running into. Whatever we talk in terms of ethics, risks, rights, and responsibilities, there are 5 environments we need to take into account, risks, rights, and responsibilities within the new environment. It's a risk. Why? Well, because if you sort of think about what I told you before, the idea wasn't that we were adding on an extra module to the world. So there's this and 1 and X and number 5. And someone may actually start thinking, oh, surely one day there will be a number 6, whatever. No, that's not the thought. The thought is that we're actually transforming the environment within which all this is happening. So that's why I prefer to talk about infosphere. Technology is progressively removing constraints that sort of are featuring conflicts. The when you have a conflict, the where you can have a conflict, the who is involved in a conflict, the how you actually engage in a conflict. And every technology makes a difference on each of these points. I remind you about cybernetics, the computer and the internet being weapons in the first place. And for the first time in the history of humanity, we have democratized weapons. Now that comes from medical applications. It doesn't mean democracy as in politics. It means something slightly different. It means that now we have in the hands of an increasingly large number of people the data and the processing power that can be transformed into a weapon. It's like saying that from now on, these days, we don't have just the doctors in power when it comes to your medical records. You also have your medical records, you can check things, you can actually go there with your Wikipedia entry. Well, likewise, no, in terms of conflicts, the number of people involved and the boundaries that they were distinguishing different combatants are being reshaped completely. So I'd rather suggest that we should treat the whole thing as informed by a digital perspective, or informational perspective, as we would rather say. The reasons being that we are, at the same time, unifying strength and weakness. The digital, of course, as I said originally, is both a weapon and a target. It's because we live in a hyper-historical society that is so dependent on the digital that society also has the means to attack another society digitally, or being attacked by a non-state entity. And Let's Archive Westphalia is not working in economics, is not working anymore in politics. Surely it doesn't work in analyzing conflicts. Not because it's wrong, but because we need more. So don't get me wrong. It's not that the state is no longer an agent. It's just that it now finds itself surrounded by a number of other agents. Agents that are not state. They are groups, organizations, flexible. They organize themselves around issues. They disappear from one day to the next. They have the power, democratization of being in rather hostile. And of course, because we are an hyper-historical society, Europe, Italy, NATO, we are also have that weakness on one side. We can be actually harmed by the same weapons that we are relying on. Of course, there are many other things that are being erased: the combatant versus non-combatant, what is or is not a battlefield, what is and what is not a military target. So the new real asymmetric point here, and I cannot emphasize this enough, is not between tank versus computer. There's so much yesterday. The real difference is between societies that are hyper-historical, rely so much on ICTs that they have the means, but also the weakness to be attacked, versus societies which are not, which do not have that weakness. So when you have a conflict between, say, a particular, say, one of the members of NATO, and a group that doesn't have an infrastructure you can actually put on its knees, but is relying on an infrastructure to harm you, well, that is the kind of asymmetric nature of the conflict that we haven't explored yet, and that's the elephant that we need to deal with. So I'd rather give you a different picture, and I'm coming to the end of my talk. The risks and rights and responsibilities that come under the general discussion of ethics. And remember, of all the questions about ethics, I pointed the finger towards only one, is what is the right thing to do? Well, in that context, I would rather like to see people who are experts discuss land, sea, airspace within an informational environment, because we are moving there. Don't think about today and tomorrow, 2020, 2050. And surely this is a trend that is stepping forward rapidly in that direction. So finally, we need to discuss what kind of ethics we need for information conflicts. And the kind of ethics that we could start developing is an ethics that has this more inclusive, more environmental, the playing with words is meant, that can take into account the whole set of issues for conflicts that address different spaces from a time perspective that makes those spaces part of the single space, the infosphere. So we must rethink the ethics of war in view of this major conceptual shift, and that's the conclusion. That's why I would like to end with suggesting that the information ethics in question is a kind of environmentalism. These are the 4 suggestions that I made in the past. The book was kindly mentioned by Dr. Tadeo in The Ethics of Information. I'd read them quickly. This is the last slide of my presentation. Entropy ought not to be caused in the infosphere. Where by entropy I do not mean the thermodynamic or concept. If you find that counterintuitive, just think in terms of destruction, annihilation, ruining something. So, say, destruction ought to be prevented in the infosphere, ought to be removed by the infosphere. So when we talk about conflicts, we're also talking about intervention for peaceful reasons. It's not always just, no, A and B fighting each other for the wrong reasons. It's also us intervening in particular contexts, doing the right thing for the right reasons. And that is removing from the infosphere the evil caused by this sort of entropy, and of course promoting the flourishing of informational entities at all levels, as well as of the environment, by preserving, cultivating, and enriching their well-being. Now this is something that even Thomas Aquinas, I bet, will be quite happy about it. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you very much. Do we have, thank you very much, Richard. Do we have any question? Randall, please.
Randy Dipert. I have a quick technical question and then a bigger question. The quick technical question is, although the term digital is ubiquitous, it does not seem to me to be an essential part of information processing or the infosphere. It happens to be the one we use. And there is speculation about going back to analog computers. So, and sometimes, too, people throw in the electronic, and that is probably wrong, too, because it can be electromagnetic or other things. But the bigger point was, in my paper, and even more in the written version, I really go after the analogy with cyberspace. And my problems are really serious, I think, now. I don't know what counts as movement in it. I don't know what its geometry is. I don't know its number of dimensions. I don't know where the boundaries and borders are. And those seem to me to be pretty important notions for a space. And it just does not seem to have some of the most characteristic features of a space as we use it in physics.
Yes. I welcome the first point about the digital. We shouldn't be so obsessed about the digital. The digital is just the, sorry for the philosophical terminology, just the specific ontology that we're using. Mm-hmm. It could be analog, it wouldn't make a major difference. There is one point to be said in favor of the digital, is infinitely more prone to be processed easily than the analog, but that is just a feature of the physics itself. So I'm 100% with you by remarking that, yes, it's not a matter of ontology. The revolution is not digits versus analog. The revolution is processing now that was not there before. Whatever makes it easy, next thing you know is some kind of weird computer we haven't even invented. On the space issue, we need to be careful because, unfortunately, there are many concepts of space. The one you mentioned is one, and is the most intuitive, is the one that would be, say, would go hand in hand with a Westphalian context. Is the geographical space of some kind. Is known by logicians, that is my profession, as Euclidean space. Let me give you to anyone else the example. Forgive me, this is really first year undergraduate example. So if you know, please, don't think that I'm sort of patronizing you. When we teach undergraduates that there are more ways of understanding space, the easiest way is to play a game. Take the chessboard. A chessboard is not a Euclidean space. It's a logical space because the distance between the queen and the pawn looks very different, depending whether you are the queen or the pawn. It's a one step for the queen and it's many steps for the pawn. So that symmetry, it would be like saying that depending on whether you are in Rome or Milan, it takes a different number of kilometers. Surely not in real world. Yes, on the chessboard, if you are the queen, it's just one go. If you are the pawn, it takes all those steps. That's a very simple, and I said, oversimplified example of why being reliant on intuitions about geography, say the war room where we have a nice map where tanks move one way or the other and the submarine is placed in the right place, is important, is necessary, but it's hugely insufficient because it would be mistaking the chessboard for a Euclidean space. Of course, we are also dealing with Euclidean space, but what I'm saying is that their space is a limit of the concept of space that we have. It would be like saying, look, just because something is in the extreme case so-and-so, then everything is so-and-so. No, actually, geography, Euclidean space is just a limit of a much wider concept. If we adopt the wider concept, then cyberspace not only becomes perfectly fine, but it becomes a place where we better be careful about our assumptions. Our intuitions that have been so helpful for all these years need to be seriously revised. What I'm warning everybody here, myself first of all included, is let's be careful about our conceptual deficit. Thinking that we have the right concept in our pockets means not seeing the elephant. It means that, for example, you mistake cyberspace as a logic space for a Euclidean space, and therefore you might actually, not you, but one might have the temptation of dismissing it. That would be at our own expenses.
Okay, thank you very much. Sandra?
Sandra Brayman, can we push the space question one step further given what you just said? I was a little bit surprised that your concept of the envelope includes 3 dimensions, but not at minimum the fourth of time.
Yes, that was, as I tried to explain at the beginning, was an attempt to provide a minimalist version. For the Romans among us, this is like testing a pizzeria by having a margarita. You never test a pizzeria by having a capricciosa. The capricciosa is suspicious. Now, if you want to have the capricciosa, we can add time, we can add agents, we can add all the toppings you like. But honestly, in industrial robotics, a space is what it is the kind of Euclidean 3D. That's where you go. If you have a catalog, you are, say, a car maker, that's what you do. I agree with you. Of course there is time. There are many other things. And time is one important variable. But I wouldn't start with the complexity. So I welcome the addition. I don't think that we should start with the complex immediately. So yes, by all means, let's add time. You're right.
Matt Sleet, University of Sheffield. Thank you very much. I'm slightly confused, really, after you telling us how we need to recognise the elephant in the room. I'm slightly unclear what the elephant in the room is still, in terms of what you think the actual threat is to hyperhistorical societies. If hyperhistorical societies are just characterised by dependence on information, it seems to me that the sheer fact there's more information, and therefore more information to be threatened, isn't in itself something we should be that worried about, just about the difference in the amount of information. So what particular dependencies do you think are both new and the things that we should be scared of?
I gather from your confusion a sense of failure on my side of conveying the message. The point about the massive amount of data was there to show how increasingly rich and complex this world is becoming. So it had nothing to do with, and those data are the targets of cyber weapons. What I was saying is that, well, that feature, as many others, we only have a limited amount of time, and only a few toppings to add. That feature in particular, I think, is very telling because it immediately clarifies to you that there is a difference. Now, when it comes to your question, I'm a rather simple-minded person, so I might be missing the point. But if you think of any sort of logistics in this country, any communication, any business-related activity, any medical-related activity, any security-related activity, anything you do from when you wake up in the morning to when you go to sleep, and you think, could I unplug? Then I hope the answer is no. If we switch off ICT from this society, we are unplugging the world, and that is something we cannot afford. The very fact that we haven't seen all the airports in this country being bombarded by digital means, it does not mean that it's not possible, and above all, it does not mean we should not be thinking about it right now, because someone just mentioned it. So I think I might have misunderstood your confusion, please forgive me, but my particular point was trivial. We are living by the digit. That's all I mean. Our life depends so much, and increasingly more and more, on what we're doing with our ICTs, that there is no way that can be kept as something that we do not care in terms of safety, control, military intervention if necessary. So I'm afraid it was, again, a rather margarita kind of dish. It was a very simple point.
Okay, and on the marguerite, I'm sorry, Mark, it's very actually appropriate because we're going to have lunch in a few minutes.
I must have felt that.
Yeah, Luciano, I think that Anna Maria.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you, Luciano, very much for your talk.